Have you ever had a civil discussion with someone you disagreed with, or who had a different perspective than you? If you have, what did you learn? Here on the Moderate Review, we try to have these kinds of discussions. So, let's talk. On this episode of the Moderate Review, I interview Colin Ferguson, a British soldier who served 2 tours in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. On this episode, we talk about the events that led to the Troubles, as well as Colin's experience and insights as a British soldier during the Troubles. If you haven't listened to the first 2 episodes, I strongly encourage you to do so. So, let's talk. Listener's note, this interview was originally recorded on July 4th, 2022.
My unpopular opinion that Top Gun Maverick is hugely overrated, despite the multi-billion box office. And I can't believe Tom Cruise, who's only about 2 years older than me, looks as well as he does. So part of it's my reason for picking it is jealousy.
Fair. I haven't seen Top Gun Maverick yet, but I definitely am surprised at how well it's doing. So. Alrighty, so then we'll just hop right into this. And so we will be talking about Northern Ireland and the Troubles. And on this particular episode, I feel like is a very unique perspective in which we'll be talking about, particularly with the Troubles. And that is a perspective you really don't hear during the Troubles, is the British forces perspective. And so before we hop right into this, could you maybe describe to me a little bit more about you? And I guess how you became involved in the Troubles.
So I was born in the west coast of Scotland in the mid-1960s. And when I joined the army, I was 20 years old in 1985. And part of the reason for joining was there's a lot of higher employment in Scotland. It was like 16% at the time. Ooh. And I had a few mediocre jobs. I didn't feel my life was getting anywhere. I'd always fancied joining the military, which for a lot of working class kids in the States and in the UK is a chance to go away and try and better yourself. So I signed up for 6 years, liked it that much. I ended up doing 22 and retired at the age of 42 in 2007. And during my time there in the army, I did 2 tours of Northern Ireland, one in Londonderry. And the reason we say Londonderry is it really just gets to the core of the conflict, because Catholics will call Londonderry Derry, and a Protestant will call it Londonderry. And you'll even hear it on the news over here. The news announcers will call it Londonderry/Derry. So in order not to offend people, because that feeling is still there. So I did 2 tours of Northern Ireland, and one as a private soldier. And one as a corporal when I was in charge of a couple of teams working on the streets over there.
Okay, and thank you for sharing that. Before we go any farther, I kind of want to give my listeners a brief history of why there is conflict in Northern Ireland. So could you, I guess from your perspective, could you kind of share or talk about how Northern Ireland became Northern Ireland?
Yeah, so I'll caveat this one. There's a lot more intelligent people out there who are far better historians than I. So if I've made mistakes in these, they're not deliberate. So I'll just caveat it with that. So really, today Northern Ireland is part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland is an independent country. Both those component parts make up the island of Ireland. But it wasn't always the case. And before 1921, the entire island, along with Wales, England, and Scotland, formed the United Kingdom. However, in January 1919, a group of Irish politicians declared Ireland an independent country, setting up its own government in Dublin. Shortly after a war followed, and Ireland was recognised as a free state by the UK. And it wasn't recognised as a free state by the UK until 3 years later. And this was a major step towards creating the Republic of Ireland as it is today. So, as I said before, Northern Ireland is one of the 4 countries of the United Kingdom. It was created as a separate legal entity on the 3rd of May 1921 under the Government of Ireland Act 1920. So that's sort of a rough outline of where it is.
And I know as we were talking about this prior to the recording, you talked about how there are a bit of a similarities between Northern Ireland and from Scotland, from what you described. Would you mind elaborating a little bit more on that?
Most people know that the main problem in Northern Ireland is religion. So you have the Catholics and the Protestants, in essence, fighting a war between themselves. And that sectarianism, as it's known, is very prevalent in Scotland, or it was when I was growing up in the 70s in Scotland. And in Scotland, Catholics went to different schools from Protestants and wouldn't mix. Uh, you have there's two football teams in Glasgow, Glasgow Celtic and Glasgow Rangers. Many people will have heard of them. But Glasgow Celtic is Catholic, Glasgow Rangers is Protestant. And there used to be lots of trouble on the streets with fighting and at the football matches. And this is basically because it was Catholics fighting Protestants with fists and bottles and all the rest of it. We sort of drew the line at that when we didn't progress to shooting with weapons and blowing people up. Obviously, the main thrust of that was they had a higher goal to meet by the Republican terrorists wanting to unite the South and the North together, and then the Protestants opposing that, and that's how, as we'll discuss later on, that's how it became more an armed conflict. But we also had things like Orange Lodges, which is a Protestant. It's very like do you have the Masons in America? I think you do, don't you?
We do, yeah.
Yeah, as a broad comparison, maybe not a good one, but the Orange Lodge is similar to the Masons. It's like a private club, but it's more overt. It's less behind the scenes. So a lot of the institutions that are in Ireland were replicated in Scotland, along with that division between Catholics and Protestants.
From your perspective, and I understand you're not a historian, but could you maybe talk about or tell my listeners a little bit how the Troubles got started?
Okay, so I mean, goes back centuries. It's centuries of conflict going back to Oliver Cromwell. As I said before, it's predominantly between Catholic Ireland and predominantly Protestant England. So it had been on the boil for hundreds of years, and tensions flared into violence in the late 1960s, leaving, and that was the start of the Troubles. And the Troubles, it's a euphemism. It's a politically convenient euphemism for a bloody insurgency that left a lot of people killed and injured. For example, during the period of the Troubles, there was 3,500 people killed. A hellish statistic. Now, 52% of them were civilians, 32% of them were security forces, which was the police and the army, and 16% of them were the paramilitaries. So a lot of the people causing this mayhem suffered the least casualties. And the responsibilities for these casualties can be broken down as the Republican terrorists caused 60% of those casualties, the Loyalist terrorists caused 30% of the casualties, and the security forces 10% of the casualties. And a lot of people are probably quite surprised at those figures because a lot of the reporting is quite skewed, and a lot of people think the army just ran riot over Northern Ireland, which is very much not the case. That's not to excuse things like Bloody Sunday, which were absolutely appalling and are well known. But at the height of the Troubles, there was 20,000 soldiers over there, and they were on the streets and out in the countryside 24/7. And I genuinely believe there is very few armies in the world could have conducted themselves the way that the British Army did. And bearing in mind the provocation, and you only have to look at your own army experiencing insurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they made the fair share of mistakes over there, as did the British Army in Northern Ireland. But bloody insurgencies amongst the population of a country are very, very complicated.
And I guess, could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about that? Because about how, I guess, because I will say this, America, we don't have really any experience, or really, at least our knowledge, of these insurgencies in the United States. So how is it that these insurgencies, are very complicated?
Well, for example, I just want to go back a bit. So, I went off down a rabbit hole there before going to the complications of insurgency. So, I think really one thing to be brought out was how unfair the Catholic population was being treated in the 1960s. And at that time, you had a new generation of politically and socially conscious young Catholic nationalists in Northern Ireland who were actually looking to your country, Jack, the United States, and seeing how the civil rights movements in America were doing with Martin Luther King and that sort of thing. And they saw that as a model for what they saw as ending as really brazen anti-Catholic discrimination in their home country. And that discrimination was open. Okay, there was this systematic discrimination in housing and jobs. Catholics couldn't get decent housing. They couldn't get decent jobs. As a good example, the biggest employer in Belfast was a shipyard, but it had a 95% Protestant workforce. So if you had a Catholic name, you weren't even going to get an interview. In the city of Londonderry, which is a 2/3 Catholic majority, the voting districts have been gerrymandered so badly that it was controlled politically by Protestant loyalists for 50 years. So, it's a very difficult situation. So going back to what an insurgency looked like. So for me, if you're a soldier, I served in Iraq. I did a few tours in Iraq as well with the army. Now, when you go to Iraq, not only is the climate different, the people look different, the housing looks different, the transport looks different, everything's different. So straight away you're in a foreign country. But if you're like me and my colleagues, and most soldiers in the army doing a tour of Northern Ireland would be 18 to 23. That's sort of the age group, and it's a lot of responsibility to put on a young guy to these, whether you're patrolling the streets of Iraq or you're in Northern Ireland. But the difference going to Northern Ireland was it was like walking down your hometown street. So you had very good training to prepare you, but it's a real dislocation of expectation. You're walking down this street, you're carrying a high-powered rifle. It resembles your high street back home, the same shops, etc. But you'd have people spitting at you, palpable hatred. People used to say to me before, "Oh, you can feel the hatred coming off people," and that sounds like an exaggeration. It isn't. You were detested and loathed, which is quite a turn of events, because when the army first deployed over there in 1969, they went there to assist the population and the Catholics, essentially, and they were welcomed by open arms by the Catholics. And a lot of historians peg the real beginning of the Troubles to August 69, when a loyalist parade in Londonderry sparked 3 days of rioting and violent reprisals. And it was the Battle of the Bogside, it was known as, and it raged for 3 days. But there's also some real bad rioting in Belfast, where loyalist mobs, aided by the police, swarmed Catholic neighbourhoods and burnt 1,500 homes to the ground. You think about that, 1,500 homes. So on August the 14th of that year, the overwhelmed Prime Minister of Northern Ireland called on the British government to send in troops to restore order. And that was the beginning of, so they went in 69, and Operation, I've just forgotten the name, I can't believe it. I'll remember it later on. But that army operation lasted until 2007. Okay.
Wow.
So basically, at this period, the entire Northern Ireland state collapsed over a period of 3 or 4 days. They couldn't maintain order, so they had to, bring the army in. And if you go on YouTube, there's footage of the army on the streets in Belfast getting cups of tea with the Catholic community, who saw them initially as saviours. But yeah, so that difference, you imagine walking down, I don't know which part of the States you're from, but walking down your hometown with a rifle, and you're there to keep the peace. Probably, for an American, it's probably a little bit different, because all your cops are armed. Anybody can go into a supermarket or a gun store and buy an automatic weapon. That is not the case in the UK. At the sight of a weapon on the streets, especially back in the 80s, more cops in the UK are routinely armed now. But back in the 80s, seeing a weapon on the streets was a rare occurrence. So when you're walking over there and there's armed soldiers on the street, it was quite a thing to see.
Before we go any farther, could you maybe describe because you did talk about these different groups, could you maybe describe these groups that took place, or that took part in the conflict?
So the main groups, obviously, they can be broken down to Protestant and Catholic. So on the Catholic side, you had the IRA, and nothing is ever simple in Northern Ireland. So you had things like the Provisional IRA, commonly referred to as PIRA. You had the Official IRA, OIRA, and then over the various years, you have there'd be fallouts and splinter groups would form, like the Irish National Liberation Army, INLA. And that was very similar on the Protestant side. You had the Ulster Defence Force, the Ulster Defence Association, all sort of different groups. The IRA and the sort of the Republican paramilitaries were also politically involved. They had Sinn Féin, and sort of in the 70s they adopted a policy of the ballot box and the Armalite, it was called. So basically they would use force, and when people, I think sometimes, so they would use force and politics in order to achieve their aim. And I think sometimes in America, certainly back in the 80s, a lot of Americans funded terrorism in Northern Ireland by contributing to the IRA's coffers. And I think a lot of Americans had a rose-tinted view about what the IRA were up to. Now, the definition of terrorism is the achievement to achieve a political means by violence. And that's exactly what the IRA did. So when people say, oh, they're freedom fighters and all the rest of it, well, I'm sorry, they fit the definition of terrorism because they've murdered people, bombed people, and bombed places in order to achieve their political means. And actually, one of the blowbacks from 9/11, that awful time when the Twin Towers was attacked, was it's actually acknowledged that woke America up to what terrorism was. And round about that time, and you could say this is a coincidence or whatever, but a lot of the continued funding towards the IRA from America totally dried up. And that funding drying up was one of the final elements that helped push the IRA over the edge to decommissioning weapons and finally realizing there was not going to be an armed solution to what they wanted to achieve in Northern Ireland.
Could you perhaps like kind of come up with a different, like a definition, or I would even say, if you could distinguish between what a freedom fighter and a terrorist is? Because I'm a little bit intrigued with that. So,
well, there's that classic, isn't it? One man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter.
Okay.
If you were to ask a South African from the 70s and 80s about Nelson Mandela, somebody in the South African security forces would say that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist, where the majority of people outside South Africa look at Nelson Mandela as a freedom fighter. That's why I don't like those terms, and that's why I fell back on that definition of terrorism. But if you're to ask a Catholic from Belfast if the hunger strikers in the Maze prison in the 1980s were terrorists or freedom fighters, you'll get the answer: they were freedom fighters. If you're to ask me, they were terrorists.
All right. Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that kind of leaves me where I'm at too. It's just, or what I originally thought was just more of like who depends on who's asking, really. So,
absolutely.
Which I'll even say this as well with the American Revolution too. That could arguably say, because my grandmother's Canadian, and she has very strong criticisms of the United States founding fathers, and basically kind of has very similar sentiments to that. Basically saying, because Queen Elizabeth is her queen. That basically the American colonists were just really just rabble rousers, really. So,
we're recording this on the 4th of July, Jack. I'm not calling America terrorists.
No, I know. Yeah,
beating us.
No, I get you. No, I'm just saying, just because I've thought about that too. More of like depending on the British side, in the American Revolution, the loyalist sides, the revolutionaries, were rebellions. They I think, from what I understand, they were called the original colonies were called the colonies in rebellion, and so I've thought about that too. So, but definitely.
But I also think, and we discussed this previously as well before recording here, that I make no bones about it. You're also a product of your environment and your place of birth. And if I was born in Derry or Belfast in a Catholic community, chances are I'd have been at least throwing rocks at British soldiers, possibly petrol bombs, and even joining the IRA. It's your product of where you're born and your environment and your circumstances and your history.
So the next part, so we did talk briefly about how you were involved in the Troubles. So you served 2 tours there, and I guess if you're comfortable with sharing this, what was like day one for you when you first got to Northern Ireland? And if you're comfortable, if you can share this, where were you stationed and what were your main duties?
So my first tour was in Londonderry, in late '88, and before you even got there on day one, you went through a rigorous training program. It was about 4 or 5 months training, and it culminated in a final exercise where you lived in what it was nicknamed Tin City, but this was a village set up to look like streets in Northern Ireland. And you lived in a security base there, a fort essentially, and the civilian population were played by other army people in uniforms, and so during that final exercise, which I can't remember, I think it was 10 days or something, maybe a bit longer, but everything that would happen to you in Northern Ireland, or could potentially happen to you in Northern Ireland, happened there. So you could go out and your patrol would be shot at, and you'd have to react to it. You'd go out and your patrol would be blown up. You'd carry out searching of people. You'd even do a full scale riot training with petrol bombs being thrown at you and things like that. So the training was very, very rigorous. It was so realistic that one of my mates lost an eye during the riot training. He got hit in the face by a brick and he lost an eye. So that gives you an idea of the reality of what you're expecting. The opposite of that was that when you went over to Northern Ireland and you arrived there and you got your briefings, you're ready to go out. On the first day, the IRA set off a car bomb just outside the security base we were operating from, which blew the main gates off. So that was our sort of welcome to Northern Ireland. But bearing in mind the training environment you just come from, where every time you went out on a training patrol, something happened, you had that mindset straight away on the street. So you went out, you're all keyed up, off you went, and you're expecting something to happen. And that wasn't the case, because the IRA couldn't sustain operations like that. But during my first tour, 2 of my friends were killed by an IED, and another 5 in my company of soldiers. There was 110, I think. So 2 were killed, and about 4 or 5 so badly wounded they were invalided out the army. So that gives you an idea of the level of violence, and also to give you an indication of control. Yes, there were things like Bloody Sunday and all the rest of it, but despite those guys getting killed and wounded, my company of 100 plus soldiers, we never fired one round, not one, during that 6 months we were there, because the rules of engagement were extremely strict and the conditions weren't met. So, again, soldiers weren't just going around randomly pumping out bullets at everybody. And you can, again, I'm not having to go to America here, but, I think going back to my thing about sometimes Americans have strange views in Northern Ireland, you look at the amount of uniform shootings on the streets of America every year. I'm not judging any police officer at all, any law enforcement officer in America at all. I've been there, I've walked that line. I know how hard it is. But though the British Army committed some really, well, they made some really bad mistakes, Bloody Sunday being one of them, I think for 40 years, 20,000 soldiers on the streets at any one time at the height of the Troubles, I think the British Army showed a remarkable restraint that few other armies could have replicated.
This concludes this episode of the Moderate Review. Please join us next time, where I continue my discussion with Colin, and we talk about his experience and reflections as a British soldier in Northern Ireland. Until next time, I'm your host, Jack Taggart. The views expressed in the Moderate Review are solely of the individuals participating, and not necessarily of the organizations they are affiliated with. If you enjoyed what you've heard, please tell your friends, and please follow us on Twitter at TModRev, that is the letter T, Mod, Rev, one word. Until next time, I'm your host, Jack Taggart. Have you ever had a civil discussion with someone you disagreed with, or who had a different perspective than you? If you have, what did you learn? Here on the Moderate Review, we try to have these kinds of discussions. So, let's talk. On this episode of the Moderate Review, I conclude my interview with Colin, and we talk about his experience and reflections as a British soldier in Northern Ireland. If you haven't listened to the previous 3 episodes, I strongly encourage you to do so. For more information and stories about the Troubles, please check out the Troubles podcast. So, let's talk. So doing these patrols, I guess, what would they look like? Would you, like, if you were tipped off, would you go investigate, look at a house? Or if there was a suspected paramilitary member, would you guys go in and actually arrest or take care of it? Or what would you guys typically do, like your day-to-day, aside from the patrols?
So day-to-day, you do a 10-day cycle. For 10 days, you would do city patrols and site security for the little security base we're on. So you do something like 8 hours on patrol, then 8 hours security protection for the base, and then you'd have 8 hours off. Now, I'd say off in inverted commas, because you'd have to clean your weapons, sort your kit out. You might well get crashed out to assist other soldiers if there's been an incident. So you're working 18 hours a day. Going back to what I was saying about these guys being 18 to 23, long hours, having to react quickly to situations and make instant decisions. So you do that there. The next 10 days, you would be on rural patrols out in the countryside. So you'd be getting dropped off by helicopter and doing patrols around the countryside, stopping vehicles. And you do that in the city as well. In the city, you do things like you stop vehicles, you put in vehicle checkpoints. You sometimes assist the RUC with house arrests. So you'd normally go in there at 3 o'clock in the morning and arrest somebody. You'd do what was called Mike Echo patrols with the RUC. So you'd participate with them doing the patrols. And a lot of time you'd have a policeman with you because they needed the protection. And that's the interesting thing. The army wasn't out there running an army operation per se. We were in the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, always had primacy of operations. So we were there to support the RUC and help them keep the peace. So you do 10 days in the countryside, and then you do things like 10 days on a permanent vehicle checkpoint near a border. There was 3 main roads coming into Londonderry, and each of them had a permanent vehicle checkpoint at the border with Southern Ireland. And that was like a little mini fort in itself. You'd spend 10 days in there, and you do patrols from there as well. A lot of time it was very mundane, but you're always keyed up. You're always like hyper alert. And that fed through to you come home, you get 5 days off during that tour, that 6 months, and you come back home, but you'd always be keyed up. You'd be like looking over your shoulder. And even to this day, I will not sit with my back to a door. It's a standing joke with me and my wife. I'll go into a cafe or a restaurant, and I have to sit so I can look at the entrances. I don't like people coming up behind me. I'm not as bad as I was, but and you talk to a lot of soldiers who served in Iraq recently. They will not sit with their back to an open door and they can't see who's coming up behind them. So that's that sort of that legacy. I mean, I was lucky. I got out after my 22 years service, my mind and body intact. A lot of my friends weren't so lucky. I had friends killed over there. I've got friends who've got PTSD from their tours over there. And the thing for the uniformed soldiers that you'll see in the sort of the old footage, we used to refer to ourselves as figure 11 targets. And the reason for that is the British Army standard target on a firing range, a man-sized target, a running man running towards you, is called a figure 11, because that's all we were. There you go. I've said it. The war in Northern Ireland, because it was a war to people like me, was won by the Special Air Service, the other specialist units, like 14 Intelligence Company, who did surveillance, and the intelligence people. We were there as just a fig leaf, and we were there to provide the IRA something to shoot at, but that was your job.
Going back a little bit, you talked about how the entire 6 months the tour you were there, you did not fire a single shot just due to the rules of engagement. So what were these rules of engagement like? Because I do know, at least in the States, there was, especially during the Vietnam War, they had very stringent rules of engagement that hindered the armed forces to do their job. So what was the rules of engagement like in Northern Ireland?
I'll just give a broad outline because my memory, we're talking 35, 40 years ago now, so it'll be quite hard for me to remember them. But the rule, it was all under something called the yellow card, and this literally was a yellow card, about I can't remember the size, a very palm-sized bit of card that was about folded open, and you carried it in your pocket with your patrol notebook. You had to carry this yellow card with you, and that laid out the circumstances in which you could return fire. So if you were engaged by a gunman and he was firing at you, you could directly engage him, but you could only fire the minimum rounds to either kill him or make you and your colleagues safe. Now, I might have this wrong. If he fired at you and had missed and was running away, I think you weren't allowed to shoot him at that point if he hadn't killed any of your patrol. Because he was running away, he was no longer a threat. If he had killed a member of your patrol and he was running away, you could engage him because he'd killed somebody. I might have that wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was things like that. And the whole thing about the yellow card was minimum force. So if you were having bricks thrown at you, that was not a reason to shoot someone. You'd escalate then by using the first thing you're told was withdraw from the area because you're the target. If you withdraw from the area, they won't throw bricks at you. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you'd withdraw from there. If you're maybe cornered and having bricks thrown at you, you could escalate to use of what's called a baton gun, which would fire baton rounds, better known as plastic bullets. So you could use them, and then if you felt you were physically being threatened and you might die, even with just bricks being thrown at you, you could in theory use fire your rifle.
Okay.
So it's probably quite badly explained, but
no, yeah, no.
There's layers of escalation there, and it was, firing a rifle was not a thing you did easily over there.
That's very interesting. Definitely runs counter to what the narrative says, So, but you lived it, so you know for yourself. Yeah. So, the next part that we'll be talking about is more of the hindsight. So in our previous recording, in our previous talk, we talked about, in your opinion, what could the British government could have done differently so that it could have prevented from an all-out shooting war that ended happening.
So I think when you go back to 1969 when the army went in, the army that went in was an army that had dealt with withdrawal from empire wars and conflict. Malaya, Aden, places like that. So they had developed tactics, techniques, and procedures for that environment. So when it all kicked off in Northern Ireland, the army didn't really have the toolbox to deal with it. Okay. And the intelligence was very, very poor. There was a famous thing called internment, where they rounded up lots of supposed IRA supporters and members of the IRA. But the intelligence was that bad, they were rounding up people who had been in the IRA in the 1930s, because the IRA isn't a recent organization. It goes back to the 1920s. They were rounding up people whose neighbors had a grudge against them. So that built up a load of... people just saying, "Oh, Mick, he's in the IRA, but Mick's maybe just owes him £50 or something." It's a very simple analogy there, but it was things like that happened. And then, of course, you had in 1972 Bloody Sunday, where the British Army shot dead 13 civilians on the streets of Londonderry. And it was only in recent years that David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, offered an apology for that. That's not something I want to get into the ins and outs of, because it's one of these things in the Troubles that's just an absolute mire of contradictions and all the rest of it. But I think what can be said there is that force that was used that day acted as a recruiting sergeant for the IRA and drove a lot of people to volunteer to fight the British Army. So I think that those early decades of poor intelligence, poor use of tactics, and excessive force really sowed the seeds for decades of trouble. And I think if the army hadn't made those early mistakes, things may well have went differently. And the IRA were having secret meetings with the British government in the early 1970s as well. They were being flown by the RAF to London in order to have secret talks. Again, perhaps without that background of what we've just discussed, would those talks have gone differently? I don't know.
So now, where are these groups now? So after the ceasefire, that I believe that was signed in 1998, or
Yeah, I think that's right.
yeah,
I'd have to have it written down again because there's so
yeah,
much
yeah, there
detail in
is, yeah,
this. Yeah,
yeah. So where, with the ceasefire, the Good Friday Agreement taking place, where are these groups now?
as I think it was Martin McGuinness or Jerry Adams once said, "We've not gone away. We're still there." And that's the case now. They are still there. They're still being monitored. A lot of them have turned their hand to crime, but the troubles is still bubbling away under the surface. And I don't know if it would go back to the full blown violence because I think there's a whole generation of people now. You think about it, there've been no real major violence there for 20 odd years. Kids have been born now who are in their early 20s have not would they put up with the troubles now? I don't think they would. And for me, I went back when the peace process kicked off. I felt the British Army had been sold down the river, and my friends had died for nothing. And but you could argue, Jack, that is any soldier could say that about most Afghanistan, Iraq, all the rest of it. Soldiers are pawns. But I went back to Belfast in 2010, 2011, and I got a bit of closure from that because the Belfast I visited was so much better than the Belfast I had known previously. And I came back thinking, yes, my friends were killed, but life for people in Northern Ireland, the vast majority, there was only something like 3,000 terrorists, possibly fewer than that. Majority of people in Northern Ireland just wanted a life like you and I do. They wanted a safe place for their kids to grow up. They wanted jobs. They wanted decent houses, and that to my eyes is happening. So I bit the bullet, and I felt a lot better when I'd visited.
What are the efforts to, I guess, continue that peace? Are like, where that was that like in Northern Ireland? Because I know there are some efforts still happening right now.
I think the monitoring these terrorist groups, as ever, not just be routine police operations. The biggest worry about return to the Troubles is, and this is a real, is the Brexit issue with the avoidance of a hard border between Southern Ireland, which is a member of the EU, and Northern Ireland, which isn't, which is part of the UK. And obviously, the majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to stay in the EU as well. That's the whole Brexit issue and avoidance of a hard border and the arguments between Britain and the EU, with again sort of Northern Ireland caught in the middle and the Protestant politicians being intransient, the Catholic politicians being intransient, and it's that intransigence that is, you see it in your country now. Between Republicans, Democrats, Trump versus Biden. There's no talk in the middle, is there? It's you're for Trump and Trump's entirely right, or you're for Biden and he's entirely right, and nobody will meet in the middle. And we see that happen over here with Brexit. Brexiteers wanted Brexit, people want to stay in the EU, and I think that's where your troubles, pardon the pun, excuse the pun. That's what happens when two sides will not talk, and we're seeing that increasingly more in the world, and that's my fear for Northern Ireland. That's how it could, get nasty again.
And I will say this, because I'm definitely kind of leaning more towards in the middle, politically. But I will say this more recently with between President Trump and our current president right now, that both parties are facing a major not reconciliation, but they're definitely rethinking a lot on how they're doing business. And so, but and I well, I don't know
Yeah.
if I'm not trying to put words in your mouth or anything, but I'm guessing that might be what be happening maybe soon, at least in the UK. So I don't know. I'm not too up to date with UK politics.
Well, do you know what, Jack? You've got to avoid violence,
Yes, agree.
because I saw it in Northern Ireland, and nobody was winning. There were some awful things happened to people over there. People being dragged off the streets, murdered. People being shot in accident by the British. It was a mess. And as a young man, see, wars and insurgencies rely on young men and women to fight them because you're not naive, but you're less likely to ask questions.
Mm. Yep.
you know,
Yeah.
and you maybe see things a bit more black and white. And as you get older, you become less. I don't know. You become more peaceful. I think I certainly, as a late 50s man now, I'm nowhere near the same person I was in my 20s. I think
Mm.
war's an awful thing. Not that I ever thought war was a good thing,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
to me, you join up as a soldier, you want to go and fight. If you join the IRA, you want to kill a soldier. And these are young men's drives that they want to do. They want to be tested.
So obviously, whenever someone goes to war, or even experiences, or even being shot at, or even experiencing something very traumatic, and this can include like all your other tours you've served, how has conflict, war, and I guess maybe paramilitary groups affected you now as a person?
I think it's made me realize what the true cost of violence is, because I had friends killed, as I said before. It also makes me realize that I always look at people who rush to violence with a very critical eye, because I think people who rush to violence often don't understand what the true cost of that is, the carnage that's left behind, where it's a ruined mind, somebody with no legs, all that sort of thing. Now, I think I said to you earlier on, I left with my mind and body intact, and I don't have PTSD and I've got no physical injuries. But again, I'll go back to when I went back to Belfast in 2010. I didn't realise then when I got off at the airport, I was on edge with the accents. I felt naked. I felt like I should have a rifle in my hand. I couldn't relax the whole time I was there. I was expecting something to happen. Where I've been lucky that I didn't have PTSD, that little snapshot there gives you an indication how 35 years down the line, subconsciously, I had been affected. Where an accent would make me, bloody hell, I don't feel right here. I feel open, I feel naked because I haven't got body armor and a rifle in my hand. But my main concern is my friends. As I say, we had a couple of years ago, we had an anniversary where we had a church. We all met up and we had a church service for the two guys that were killed. And I hadn't seen some of those guys for 35 plus years. And one of the guys that turned up had been so badly wounded. He was 18 years old. He's never worked since. And I thought, I didn't, it was quite hard for me because you think I didn't give that guy a second thought. He wasn't a particularly close friend of mine, but I just thinking what I did in those years. I had an army career. I had a second career in the civilian world. I bought houses. I had great holidays. That guy's life was ruined at the age of 18. And that to me is a snapshot. My friend JD. As you know, I do a podcast myself, and my friend Neil Hogg came on, and he was involved in the IED incident that killed my friends Stephen and Miles. And he was telling me that, and again, I didn't realize this, he's been struggling with PTSD all his life. And 2 weeks after, basically, when the IED went off, he was in a Land Rover that was basically flipped on its rooftop, and he was trapped amongst the dead and the injured. Okay, and petrol, gas from the vehicle was leaking out over him. And so we recorded this podcast, and 2 weeks later, he's a policeman now in Australia. He attended a road traffic accident in Australia with a motorcyclist who was lots of blood and petrol, and it triggered a PTSD incident with him. So again, that's an example of, these people carrying these problems with him all the life, and the army doesn't care. In the podcast, Neil was having serious trouble with PTSD while he was serving in the army, and he went and saw a lieutenant colonel army psychiatrist who basically said to him, "You need to man up because this is what we do."
Huh.
And he eventually had to leave the army because he couldn't cope, and he was on the verge of self-harm and all the rest of it. And it wasn't until he got a civilian who had been in the army to give him the proper help that he needed that he managed to recover. But he struggled for about 7 or 8 years, and the army just cast him off, didn't care. And again, that's replicated hundreds of times. I'm not just coming here from the army. I saw what the civilian population had to deal with over there, and they'll be suffering from the same things. Civilians get PTSD. Civilians that saw completely awful things, because at the end of the day, those civilians were caught between us, the army, and the terrorists. And as ever, it's them that pay the biggest price. And you should never forget about the civilian population and the hell, literally hell, that they went through during the whole of the Troubles.
One more final question before we wrap up. So, in our previous recording that we had that didn't save, you talked about how, and earlier you mentioned how the violence really stayed between Scotland and, the violence between Scottish and Catholic Scotsmen really never escalated beyond the football teams. Why did it not escalate to an actual full-on shooting war?
I think ultimately because the ultimate political goal, there was no grand scheme there. It was violence for violence sake, and it's like that sectarianism where my father wasn't like that. He was not a man who said to me, "You're a Protestant, you must hate Catholics." That was never said to me. I just ended up going to a Protestant school. My friends were Protestant because that's where you make your friends, generally speaking, isn't it? When you go to school.
Mm-hmm.
But there was no grand political scheme like the North joining with the South. But I think I'd broadly compare that sectarianism to anti-Semitism in some respects. It's that hatred's taught in the family, isn't it? It's like racism. It's handed down. If I'm born into a household, I'm not born a racist, I'm not born an anti-Semite, and I'm not born somebody who hates a Catholic. You have to be taught it. It was taught, but it just stopped at violence on the football terraces.
As we're closing up, one of my final things I'll ask: is there any final thoughts you'd like to make before we close?
I do think, I hope people will listen to this and maybe they'll go away and do a bit more research on the British Army in Northern Ireland, because I think a lot of Americans do have a one-dimensional view on the Troubles. And I'm not getting all preachy here and saying the British Army was great over there. We made a hell of a lot of mistakes. But I think the IRA won the propaganda war in the United States. That's all I'll say.
My last question: if anybody wanted to learn more about you or about your podcast, where would my listeners go to find out?
If they could just Google The Unconventional Soldier, that's the name of our podcast. It's a historical-based podcast. We have an episode on Northern Ireland. We have a New Zealand-Vietnam War veteran on it. We cover Afghanistan. We cover the Falklands War. So it's very much a historical-based podcast. If you're interested in military history, please look us up and give us a listen.
As I listen to both Joe and Colin speak about their experiences of the Troubles, I cannot help but notice how traumatizing the conflict was to everyone involved. If those involved had not rushed to violence, but rather would have sat down and had a conversation, perhaps the violence would have never happened. After speaking to these men, I have come to a greater understanding of what hatred can do to a society, and how under different circumstances we could be placed into a conflict similar to the Troubles. It is our job to speak out whenever we see injustice, but we should never resort to violence. Rather, we should seek peaceful and productive solutions. Until next time, I'm your host, Jack Taggart. The views expressed in the moderate review are solely of the individuals participating and not necessarily of the organizations they are affiliated with. If you enjoyed what you've heard, please tell your friends, and please follow us on Twitter at TModRev, that is the letter T, mod, rev, one word. Until next time, I'm your host, Jack Taggart.